SOL8F, the progressive movement. Here we go. The progressive movement, this particular period in history, things weren't, they weren't great for everybody. We talked a little bit about it, how immigrants were being treated and stuff like that. So the whole goal of the progressive movement was to improve the lives of everybody. You got political, social protests going on, trying to really make a push and trying to improve the life and living arrangements of all Americans. Why do we need this particular movement? The excesses of the Gilded Age, that period of robber barons, the period of the captains of industry, all right, the Rockefellers, the Carnegies, those kind of guys. They were living this lavish life, and it was crazy because they'd have these huge parties. If you've ever read The Great Gatsby or seen the movie The Great Gatsby, you see the big lavish lifestyles that these guys are living, and you see all the parties and the fancy dress and all big buffets and just everything was so big and extravagant. But literally right outside the gates of those mansions and homes, people were living in the streets. Families of two or three families, 15, 16 people living in these one room tenement houses, like some of the pictures that we've seen in previous units. All right. So there was this huge disparity in income. It was bad. All right. 1% of the population controlled 90% of the wealth, basically. All right. And these robber barons, these captains of industry, they're forming monopolies. They're forming trusts. They're buying up everything, and they're not allowing anybody to get their own businesses going. Carnegie with the steel industry, he owned every steel plant. All right. Rockefeller, when he takes over, he didn't just own all of the oil companies. He bought out the little guys and he took control of everything. And then he bought out all the railroads, and then he bought out all the steel plants and everything else. So you couldn't really form your own small business. All right. You didn't have the opportunities that every American was supposed to have. Here you can see Rockefeller in this particular image. You got the Capitol building, you got the White House, basically with Rockefeller stuffing Congress with whoever he wanted in charge, somebody that was going to vote in his favor and ensure that he was able to keep all of his wealth. Um, Another thing that the progressive movement's going to work for is they're working for better working conditions. All right, we've seen some pictures. Here we got a picture down in the bottom. Look at how tight everything is. Look at how on top of everybody they are when they're working. Dirty conditions, long hours, low wages. Um, they're working 10, 12, 16, 18-hour days sometimes. All right. And they're not making nothing but pennies on the dollar. All right. Women and children, same thing. They're not getting anything out of it. There was no workman's comp. If you were sick or you got hurt on the job, oh well, next man up. You didn't have any benefits. You couldn't retire because there was no retirement. Okay, you had to work until you couldn't work anymore. And then when you couldn't work anymore, you had no income. So that's one of the things that the progressive movement is going to try to do is try to push to better those conditions. There's my picture. Daycare before labor unions screwed it all up. Child labor was a serious problem. All right. And we'll get a little bit more into it, but just think about it. Why would people want to hire children? Well, primarily the reason that they want to hire the children is because they can fit into smaller spaces. You could put more of them into a room to work. Not to mention, if one of your machines goes down, a child can reach their hand in the gears that someone like myself wouldn't be able to reach into. Okay, so these children they're gonna be the ones that are trying to fix these machines, and it doesn't always end well for the kids. Dangerous working conditions. One of the major things, the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory. If you get a chance, look it up, watch a video about Triangle Shirtwaist. Basically, This particular incident right here changes everything dealing with working conditions. Triangle Shirtwaist, a whole bunch of women were working in a building, and somebody threw a cigarette butt into a trash bin. And when they did, everything caught on fire. There was only one elevator out. So, you had to wait for the elevator to come back up. There was no fire escapes. When the fire department got there and they raised the ladder couldn't reach the floor that they were on. So there's all sorts of issues that come out of that. Different diseases, lung disease, miner's lung, things like that, where individuals who were working in some of these conditions were contracting diseases that were causing them to die. Okay. Um, and now you see all the commercials about, if you worked in this particular industry, you might have a case against them and things like that. Back then, they didn't have that. There wasn't a case against anybody. You got what you got, and that you dealt with it. There's a picture of Triangle Shirtwaist. 141 men and girls die inside the factory. Notice how they say men and girls, not women, kind of taking the women down a notch, not giving them the respect that they deserve. They were trapped inside the building, couldn't reach, and for the majority of them, if you look down here at the picture on the right, um, they didn't even have the names of most of them. They were just labeled in a box with a number. Company towns. I know I spoke about it just a little bit, but we're going to get a little bit more in depth with it here. Company towns. If you work for some of these particular industries, you were required to live in a town that was set up by the company. So here's the thing with this. Say, for example, you work for Rockport Redwood Company in Rockport, California. So you work, when you go to the grocery store, you're buying the groceries from the Rockport Redwood Company grocery store. Who's the money going back to? You got it. The Rockport Redwood Company. Okay. The rent that you're paying for the house that you're living in, that's provided to you by the company, and the rent goes right back into the company's pocket. You go to the doctor, it's a company doctor. The money goes right back into the company's pocket. So basically, everything that you were paying for was going right back into the company. And to be honest with you, they weren't really giving you the best living conditions and things like that. So your wages were just lining the pockets back of those that own those particular companies when you worked in one of these company towns. What are the goals of the labor union? Three main goals. First, higher wages. Like I said, people were working for pennies on the dollar. There was no minimum wage. Women were working for even less, and children even less than women. But they were still working the same type of jobs, the same hours, the same conditions, and yet they weren't getting paid the same for it. There was an idea that they wanted fewer hours. Okay, so labor unions are going to form. They want these fewer hours. 8-hour workday is the goal, and safer conditions. All right, so four major labor unions that are going to come out of this. The Knights of Labor. Terrence Powderly is going to establish this particular union, and this union was designed for skilled laborers. Okay, the American Federation of Labor, or the AFL, was designed for any labor worker. Anybody could apply for that. Samuel Gompers. The American Railways Union. Who did they support? Got it. The railway workers. And the International Ladies Garment Workers Union, the ILGWU. Yes, they were set up to help women who worked in the garment industry. All right. Couple things that happened because of these labor unions. Protests, right? Strikes. You've seen them, you've heard about them. Well, some of the major strikes that are going to happen, Haymarket. All right, this one happens Chicago, May 4th, 1886. This is going to be an extremely uh, um, dangerous protest. Starts off just as your common protest strike, and then things get violent. Somebody throws a Molotov cocktail here, punches are thrown here, cops and the protesters get into it. The whole goal was to get an 8-hour workday for laborers. All right. But it becomes violent. And this ultimately leads to the demise of the Knights of Labor. Homestead. This is one of Carnegie steel plants right there in Pennsylvania. All right. This lasts for 143 days. All right. It's a bloody dispute. There's a lot of fighting, things like that. The whole goal was to get the iron workers compensation. They weren't being paid what they thought they deserved. And because of that, the labor unions step in. The National Amalgamated Association of Iron and Steel Workers, and they're going to have this battle back and forth, and eventually, Carnegie, kind of gives in, and those workers get their compensation. The Pullman strike. This one really messes everything up because the ARU gets involved, and what's happening is workers were getting paid X amount of dollars, let's say $10, and then the next time they looked at their paycheck, it was only 9, and then 8. So they filed this grievance with the ARU, and the ARU got involved. And once the ARU gets involved, goes through all this litigation and everything else. I'm not going to bore you with all of that. And eventually, what's going to happen is the ARU says, "Look, Pullman, who made these beautiful, beautiful passenger cars, they said, look, any train that pulls Pullman cars will not be operated by anyone who's a member of the ARU." So all these railroads shut down, trains shut down, materials weren't being taken from point A to point B because there was a Pullman car on the line. Okay, eventually Pullman has to give in because everybody else was losing money and people stopped using Pullman cars because of that. So labor unions do a good job. They really get done what they want to accomplish in most cases. This is what a protest looked like back then. Very simple. Um, Everybody had the same flyers and everything. What happens because of the labor union? You get that 8-hour workday. All right. The way the day was broken up: 8 hours for work, 8 hours for rest, and 8 hours for what we will or recreation, which leads to a lot of different things really coming about. It's when you start seeing more sports involved, like baseball. You start seeing theme parks and amusement parks. Coney Island is a big one. Um, Vaudeville shows. Um, and it also leads to a lot of problems, which we'll get into a little bit later on. All right, so moving on to the progressive movement, just to keep kind of flowing with things. Um, so look, the reason that we have this progressive movement, there's a lot of stuff going on. Um, um, the economic exploitation that we talked about, the monopolies, taking advantage of the natural resources, political corruption, the political machines that were running the cities. All right. People like Boss Tweed and things like that who were being very corrupt and taking over the cities. Not to mention the social injustices as well. You got all the things like there was no consumer protection. If you bought something that went bad, there was nothing to protect you against it. You've got the race and gender inequality, economic inequality, children's labor. Like I said, you had tons of kids the same age as my boy here, 9 years old, that were working in these dangerous factories that were being forced to stick their hands inside of looms to unjam them. And then their hands get hung up and, bad things happening. Okay. So you got all these different things that's going to lead to the progressive movement. The progressive movement, what they wanted to do was, first of all, they wanted to make sure that everybody had the opportunity to make equal money. Okay. Then they wanted to increase democracy. They wanted to allow everybody to have a chance to have their voice be heard in the government. And finally, they wanted to increase social justice. They wanted to get rid of things like Jim Crow. They wanted to allow for women to be able to have the right to vote because women still don't have the right to vote yet. Okay. Women still don't have the right to vote yet, but that time's coming soon. Primarily because of the progressive movement. All right. Now, you got this group called the Muckrakers. All right. And the Muckrakers are a group of journalists, and I'm going to let Caleb tell you about a couple of those.
Muckrakers were journalists who dug up on politics, industry, economy, and society. Ida Tarbell's father worked for Standard Oil. She interviewed many people who worked for the company, including one of the founders, to prove Rockefeller was rigging railroad prices and destroying the competition.
So Ida Tarbell, she's going to write this book called The History of the Standard Oil Company. It starts off just as a bunch of uh, entries in a magazine, okay, that she was working for. And once everything really starts flowing, what she does is she starts attacking some of these major people in the industries. And then once she gets a big enough following of people that agree with her and are reading her stuff, then she really hits hard and goes after Rockefeller, who at that point in time was the most powerful man, not only in the country, but also in the world.
Lincoln Steffens wrote a series of journal articles talking about the corruption of major U.S. cities, including Pittsburgh, Chicago, St. Louis, Philadelphia, Minneapolis, and New York.
So Lincoln Steffens, he writes these journal entries, these journal articles, which are eventually put into a book called The Shame of Cities, where he just goes through and he bashes the political and economic lives of a lot of these people that were running the countries. This little quote down here by him: "In all cities, the better classes, the businessmen, are the source of corruption, but they are so rarely pursued and caught that we do not fully realize whence the trouble comes." A lot of people just overlooked it because they had the money and they were able to shut people up.
In 1906, Upton Sinclair wrote "The Jungle". His purpose was to show the corruption and horrible sanitary conditions in the meat packing industry. This novel uses fictional characters to describe real-life situations in detail.
So Upton Sinclair writes The Jungle, and The Jungle is one of the most disturbing novels. Not only because of the corruption that it showed, but because of some of the things that it really goes into detail at. Like he says here, Upton Sinclair said, "I aimed at the public's heart, and by accident I hit them in the stomach." Because what he started to realize was that he worked undercover in a couple different meat factories, and what's going to happen is, as he's going through and he's working in these places, he's seeing some of the horrible things that are happening. People dropping meat on the floor and then just throwing it in packages anyway. Spoiled meat being ground up and used as ground beef. Somebody using a meat grinder and they stick their hand in it and their hand gets stuck and gets ground up. Well, that's just extra meat that they didn't have to pay for. It's free profit there. All right. So a lot of things like that really started to happen. Thanks, Kelly. So these people, these muckrakers, all right, these muckrakers, what they're going to do is they're really going to start to show some of the dirt that's happening behind the scenes. All right. Um, these muckrakers, they go through and they tell people what's happening in these um different industries. All right. And they're telling people about what's happening with these children that are working. For example, look at the picture over here. These kids, probably just like Caleb, what you just saw, 9 years old, maybe younger, maybe just a year or two older, but they're not much older than him. They're his age, and they're being forced to work in the coal mines. All right. So a couple pieces of legislation are going to come down from this. First of all, Sherman Antitrust. All right. The Sherman Antitrust Act is going to basically say monopolies are illegal. All right. It busts up monopolies. No more monopoly. Nobody can own all of one industry anymore. The Clayton Antitrust then comes in and changes things because, see, what was being talked about was that, if you think about it, a labor union is a monopoly on labor. because just like with the ARU, with the American Railways Union, when they shut down all these railroads because they wouldn't allow anybody to work on a Pullman line, um, they kind of had a lock on it. They had a lock on that particular aspect of industry. So Sherman Antitrust comes in and says, look, unions are not a monopoly. Unions can still function. Um, but it also outlaws price fixing, because once the monopolies were busted up, these wealthy individuals, Standard Oil and stuff like that, were still able to um, put smaller businesses under, because they were able to price fix with partners. Okay. It also establishes the Federal Reserve, which is where all the money is basically stored. Another thing that's going to happen, because we talked about they wanted to increase democracy, primary elections. No longer will one person be essentially given the opportunity to become a president. Okay, so you got primary elections, which we've been having over the last, you know, um, few months. They're talking about, they had all the primaries where people were voting between Biden and all that stuff. And it also led to the direct election of senators, the 17th Amendment. Okay. Uh, Senators weren't elected before. Senators were appointed. And basically, it was your Rockefellers and your Carnegies and guys like that were appointing or making sure that those senators got appointed, the ones that they had in their pocket. Now, the American people actually got to vote who would represent them in the Senate. Another thing that's going to come out of this, let me go back here real quick. Another thing that's going to come out of this is private voting booths. Okay. Before this whole progressive thing, there were no private voting booths. When you voted, there was somebody standing over your shoulder. You could be intimidated into voting for somebody you didn't want to, just because there was somebody there. But now you go into a private booth, you got, barriers set up so that nobody can see who you vote for, and you're good to go. 19th Amendment. Here you go, women. 1919. Women have the right to vote. It finally happens. Women are now politically equal. Okay. We talked about some of the earlier people that really helped with this movement. You had Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Now in this second wave of movements, you have Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul. Women stepped up during World War One, and we'll talk about World War One a little bit later on. But the women really stepped up during that period and took over the industries when men had to go off to war. And because of a lot of these things, and because of just how hard the women have worked, and because it's the right thing to do, women finally get the right to vote. 1919, 19th Amendment. There's some of the lovely ladies of the suffrage movement. Again, women joined the workforce during World War One. They really got involved in the industries. They started working in coal mines and doing all the same jobs that men were doing before they had to go off to war. And again, 19th Amendment. Here's the women. Bottom right-hand picture, you got the women that are signing the Seneca Falls Declaration. Some states allowed women to vote prior to 1919. All right. Those states in green, partial, women could vote for some offices. Typically, it was like mayor, city council members, things like that. And look, obviously, you got the South and the East Coast where women had no suffrage at all until a federal amendment is passed. Some other progressive accomplishments: socially, consumer protection. The Meat Inspection Act to ensure that all meat was real meat, and not hand or something that had gone rotten. Also, you get the Pure Food and Drug Act passed. The Pure Food and Drug Act, to make sure that what the ingredient list says is in it is what is actually in that particular item. The 18th Amendment is passed. Prohibition. No longer can you produce or sell produce or sell alcohol in the United States. It is illegal. All right. And that's going to go back to that whole 8-hour workday thing. 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 8 hours of whatever you want turned into 8 hours of work, 8 hours of rest, 6 hours of drinking, 2 hours of fights at home. So you get a whole bunch of movements that are going to come out of this that are going to push to have alcohol prohibited, to have this prohibition passed. Eventually, what's going to happen is the country's really going to start to lose a lot of money because of taxes and everything else. That they're going to repeal the 18th Amendment and pass the 21st Amendment, which again allows for the production and sale of alcohol. It's the only amendment that's ever been revoked. All right, that's it. It's SOL 8. Make sure you answer your ILO questions, and I'll catch up with you on 9 later on.